I'm Sarah Halter. I'm the executive director here at the Indiana Medical History Museum. Come on in. I want to welcome you to the 2026 John E. Pless, MD Memorial Central State Circle Lecture. This one is in memory of Dr. John Pless, who was a pathologist down in Bloomington and who was a very long time supporter of the museum in many, many ways. And I'll tell you a little more about him in just a minute. But I want to welcome you all here to the Indiana Medical History Museum in the old pathology building. For those of you here or online who have never been here before, we are housed in the 19th century pathological department of Central State Hospital, which was Central Indiana Hospital for the Insane when this building opened in 1896. It closed as a lab in 1968 with many of the original furnishings, equipment, specimens, records, all that stuff still intact. And within a year, reopened as a museum. And so we're not able to stay open today after the program, but I would invite you to come back for a tour. You can find out more on our website. It's imhm.org. This is a series named in memory of John Pless, who, again, was a longtime volunteer, board member, and financial supporter of the Indiana Medical History Museum. He's remembered for his passion and enthusiasm, his friendship and generosity, and his sense of humor. This series is an opportunity for us to thank our members of the Central State Circle as well for their continued support of the museum and the old pathology building. So I'm going to introduce our board president, Dr. Jane Schultz, and then she's going to introduce our speaker. You ready? Okay.
Good afternoon to everyone. We're so glad to see you all. And I'll also say that David Zonner is also on our board. I think that's one thing that of his many titles that we didn't say. So I'm, of course, delighted to introduce my colleague, a colleague from my branch of the scholarly universe, Andrew Donnelly, who is currently assistant professor of English at the University of Memphis. Before Andy went to Memphis, he spent a couple of years at the Center for Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi, where he completed his first book. You see it here, it's in the front here also. Confederate Sympathies. It's a study of same-sex romance, disunion, and reunion in the Civil War era. Published in 2025, just fairly recently, by the University of North Carolina Press in their Gender and American Culture series. The book explores narratives of same-sex friendship in period fiction, memoirs, political cartoons, newspapers, and so forth, showing how such friendships consolidated white supremacist thinking both during and after the Civil War. It's a great read, and Andy has some copies with him if you'd like to purchase one after the lecture. One of the more fascinating projects Andy launched during his graduate years at Harvard was a program to recruit and train doctoral candidates to teach month-long summer courses to Mississippi high school students. When you look through a person's curriculum vitae, you always find some interesting things. And I haven't talked to him about this, but I think I will eventually because I'm really interested in learning more about how that went. He did it for quite a number of years, too. Still involved now. Well, after finishing his PhD in 2020, the Mellon Foundation awarded him a public fellowship at the National Book Foundation, one of numerous distinctions Andy has already received during his brief career. Since that time, he has obviously been busy writing, and in addition to his recent monograph, he has published articles in some of our field's most prestigious journals. He's already hard at work on the next book, a study called The Depoliticization of American Culture, 1877 to 1933. I think you will find his talk on Union Surgeon General William Hammond and medical understandings of the 19th century same-sex desire both surprising and informative. Please extend him a warm welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for welcoming me to the Indiana Medical History Museum and to Indianapolis. Thank you to Sarah Halter in particular for inviting me, and to Jane Schultz for the introduction that she gave and for setting up everything with this talk. I really appreciate this, Jane, for welcoming me here. Today, I'll be speaking about an important figure within the U.S. history of medicine, William Alexander Hammond, and the history of homosexuality. What I'll be trying to do is think about where the Civil War fits into the history of homosexuality, and using Hammond, who was the Surgeon General of the Union Army, as a way to answer that question. First, what do I mean by the history of homosexuality? One thing that could mean, of course, is the stories of same-sex desiring people in the past, people we might, with anachronistic terminology, describe as gay, lesbian, or queer figures from the past. That history is less my focus today than the history of homosexuality as it is the way the understanding of how same-sex desire and behavior and same-sex desiring people were understood, thought about, treated by society, medicine, and the law. So especially from the 19th century through the beginning of the 20th century, that story operates very much within the history of medicine. To begin, I want to sketch that 19th century history as a time it's a time of significant transformation in the way that sexuality and same-sex sexuality was understood, a tremendous conceptual shift that historians of sexuality have accounted for in a number of ways. The most notable way of accounting for that shift has been to see it as an evolution from sexual acts to sexual identities. That is, from the things that you do to who you really are. Before this transformation, what we think of as homosexuality might in many contexts have been highly reprobated, but it was a reprobated set of practices, of actions, rather than signaling a perverse personality or permanent sexual orientation. Crucially, this does not just mean that homosexuality as a sexual orientation and a term had to be invented, but that heterosexuality too, as a permanent orientation and identity, also had to be invented, and would be only after homosexuality emerged as a social problem. So conceived of as acts, same-sex sexuality was primarily a problem of law breaking. There were laws against sodomy in the United States from the colonial era onward, but the enforcement of those laws in practice proved a very different story. Prior to the 1880s, there are relatively few examples of criminal punishment for same-sex sexual acts. Those identified tend to be what we might still think of as criminalized today, non-consensual, abusive, or with a child. We should not think of this period as one with an open tolerance for homosexual acts, but it was also not one with significant criminal enforcement. Then, in a transformation that will prove crucial for my talk today, homosexuality becomes a problem within medicine. It becomes a problem defined in terms of medical conditions and subject to the idea of treatment. And towards the end of the century, it becomes a legal problem, a problem for which legal thinkers believe that there must be new mechanisms of enforcement and surveillance, as well as new laws to combat, manage, and in the hopes of some, eradicate this social issue. So the difference I mean between on the left a moral problem of law breaking and on the right a legal problem is that at the beginning of the 19th century, the infrequent and arbitrary punishment of same-sex behavior follows long existing moral laws put to use. By the end of the century, the legal problem is one that requires new responses, new laws, new technologies to combat practices that are perceived of as being on the increase. One additional way to think about this transformation is from a conception of same-sex sexual behavior as clustered around sites or places. For men, the sea, boats, the Navy, as well as the frontier are all conceived of as places of significant same-sex society and sexual activity, in contrast to the home and village. By the end of the century, sexuality has adhered to individual people. It's not different where you are in the world. It's a permanent orientation attached to you. Lastly, we might examine the same phenomenon from a different perspective. One final way that people had viewed sexuality was in a developmental model in which the intense same-sex intimacies of youth gave way in maturity to mature cross-gender interest. This was no doubt coincidental with a world in which very much of young people's lives, starting with schools, were segregated by gender. Therefore, we might contrast that again to a later view where a permanent orientation adheres to an individual not merely across space, but also across time. Now, I think that this transformation is difficult for us to conceptualize today because for many of us, there is a strong feeling not to mention often a political urgency to think of sexual orientation as having somehow, somewhere at the base of it, a biological origin. I think this historical view, this transformation across the 19th century, can challenge that sense, and maybe it should. But I also don't think that the idea of this transformation is wholly at odds with a theory of biological origin. What it would mean instead is that the underlying biology gets its cultural expression in the early 19th century as understood primarily through acts, sites, and development, while by the 20th century, it finds expression in from-birth permanent orientations, which from our vantage point appears closer to the biology as we understand it. All of that's to say, as a sort of warning at the beginning here, that for the purposes of this talk, you don't have to embrace a totalizing view of homosexuality's social construction, just merely that the idea that its expression and cultural understanding is going to change across the century and over time. But my very vague before and after begs the question, when did this happen? Of course, this was not a singular process, but an evolution across several decades, roughly from the first typologies of sexual perversion in the 1840s, through the emergence of ideas like an inverted sexual desire in the 1870s, to the coining of terms like homosexual and heterosexual, which appear in the United States in the work of James Kiernan in 1892. Among this list of titles of medical research, we might find signposts of cultural history in the 1860 edition of the Calamus poems celebrating the manly love of comrades to Whitman's Leaves of Grass, or the conviction of Oscar Wilde for homosexuality in 1895. This history represents the movement of ideas primarily from Germany by way of Great Britain to their reception in the United States. So these ideas are arriving in the United States, which at the time is very much in a process of transformation, coming out of the century's central event for that nation, the U.S. Civil War of 1861 to 1865, whose aftermath some historians refer to as the world the Civil War made. If so, one question provoked by this chronology with respect to U.S. history is where and how the U.S. Civil War fits into this transformation. That's the subject of my talk today, and it's also the subject of one thrust of the book, Confederate Sympathies. Given the national transformation it engenders, there are good reasons to expect that the Civil War played a role in these transformations in sexuality. First, from the perspective of social history, the Civil War represented an incredible mobilization of citizens of all kinds as people were rapidly reconfigured into camp life, while the home front was equally transformed by absence. The homosocialization, meaning the society of people of the same gender, of that camp life, as well as other transformations, including the emancipation of 4 million enslaved Americans and the changes to medical practices around death, medicine, and law, make this a moment in U.S. history ripe for significant social change. Then, in terms of intellectual history, historians have variously seen the conceptions of citizenship, rights, contract, civic religion, national identity, philosophical pragmatism, literary and artistic realism, sensory experience, and death itself all utterly transformed by the war that, in the words of the novelist Henry James, marks an era in the history of the American mind. There are also comparative reasons to expect that the U.S. Civil War would be central to transformations in conceptions of sexuality, given, for example, the role that the experience of the First World War plays in histories of the emergence of modern gay identity, or that the Second World War plays in the 20th century's story of coming out, not to mention how imbricated were the debates about the military and gay rights during our own recent history, both across both wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Much of the US history of homosexuality suggests that military experience is a primary domain in how Americans think about the relationship between sex practices and citizenship. So for these three different sets of reasons, I think there are good reasons to look for the Civil War as part of this story of sexuality's transformation in the 19th century. But the Civil War presents a significant problem with respect to this history. Namely, it does not contain the evidence present within the archives of other US wars. So we might at this point consider a central problem to the history of homosexuality, that of evidence. Unfortunately, much of what is considered the evidence of homosexual behavior or same-sex desiring people prior to our own modern era, and at least the clearest and least disputable evidence, comes by way of homophobic repression. Criminal records of people accused of same-sex behaviors or accompanying news reports, medical diagnoses or accompanying studies, military court-martials, and other disciplinary actions in schools or other institutions. The Civil War presents a great problem precisely because it predates the rise of legal and medical attention to the problem of homosexuality, and as such, it contains very, very little of any such evidence of homophobic repression. In fact, one commendable book of research on the topic of sex in the Civil War, when turning its attention to same-sex sex, identifies only 3 misconduct charges that appear to be related to homosexual behavior, a vanishingly small number among the millions of soldiers and millions of disciplinary actions within the war's archive. What appears instead is a vast archive of materials, at times suggestive, but never of the evidentiary status of a criminal conviction for homosexual acts. There are instead routine descriptions among nearly all soldiers of male-male co-sleeping arrangements, same-sex dances, routine homosocial nudity, memories of intense comradely affection, occasional unelaborated allusions to male prostitution, and many real-life and fictional instances of cross-dressing, usually of women dressing as men to fight the war. In compiling this list, I don't mean to suggest that any of this is on its own evidence of homosexuality from the Civil War. Only that we might assume that the experience of same-sex sexual desire or behavior within the Civil War is likely somewhere amorphously within this broader archive. But the problem of evidence for that history is that it appears that whatever homosexual desire or activity existed within the Civil War was treated as mostly unproblematic and mostly unremarkable. Where that history is and how it fits within the social and political history of the Civil War and the world the Civil War made is the subject of my book, Confederate Sympathies, which looks mostly to cultural sources from Walt Whitman, who's in the top right corner there, to these cross-sectional chums from the 1915 white supremacist film Birth of a Nation, with an eye to how depictions of male-male romance get deployed for political argument. In my account, that political argument tends to be on the conservative side, pro-slavery, pro-Confederate, and lost cause politics. But in the book, I also try to answer the question of where the Civil War fits within the history of homosexuality. And for that answer, I turn to a very prominent Civil War figure, the Union Army's Surgeon General, William Alexander Hammond, the subject of the rest of this talk. A career military man, for the first half of his life, Hammond was a surgeon in the U.S. Army for the decade before the U.S. Civil War, including with the Army fighting the Sioux people in New Mexico in the 1850s. He briefly left the Army to teach at the University of Maryland before returning with the commencement of the Civil War in 1861, returning, that is, to the military. The following year, at age 34, Hammond was appointed the Army's Surgeon General, at the moment when Congress decided that military physicians would be appointed and promoted on the basis of merit rather than seniority. Following that spirit, Hammond led a series of reforms to professionalize the Army's medical corps, including qualifying examinations for physicians and hierarchies among surgeons, doctors, and nurses. One of Hammond's most controversial reforms was to ban the mercury compound calomel from army medicine. Subordinate surgeons and doctors, many of whom were doctors of small northern communities before the war, who lacked professional training, rebelled against Hammond's directives. This much discussed and oft-told story of Civil War medical history is seen as a conflict between Hammond's professionalizing reforms and folk practices of his subordinates, but it's a conflict that got refracted through the personal politics of Army leadership and became the pretext for Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who personally did not like Hammond, to dismiss him. It's from this fight over calomel that the cartoon that I started with is from. Hammond, therefore, had a tenure much shorter than the war itself, but he left a significant mark on the war's medical history. Hammond viewed the war, tragedy though it was, as an opportunity to build medical knowledge through the widespread and urgent medical needs, as well as through bureaucracies that could systematize and organize knowledge. Hammond launched the Army Medical Museum, which still exists today as the National Museum of Health and Medicine, and also planned for the printing of the medical and surgical history of the war. The idea that American medical science could learn from the wounded of the Civil War, as Shauna Devine argues, was instrumental to the history of American medicine, was an idea largely instigated by William Hammond. After the Civil War, Hammond established a private practice in New York City, specializing in neurology, the early neurological study that shares a genealogy with present-day psychology, and which in its form then may appear more like present-day psychology than present-day neurology. Hammond's cash-based practice, treating an upper middle class and upper class clientele, may be representative of Paul Starr's narrative in The Social Transformation of American Medicine, toward a high status medical profession, toward the increased specialization of practices, toward organizing knowledge and credentials through exclusive professional associations, such as the American Neurological Society, and toward an expanding role of the medical profession in directing social policy. Hammond's biographer, Bonnie Bluestein, situates him as a founder in the fields of neurology and psychology. Hammond was deeply influenced by his contemporary, the French neurologist Charcot, whose portrait is upstairs in one of the rooms upstairs we saw yesterday, and whose influence extends to the neurological science happening here at this hospital as well. Hammond was a co-founder of the American Neurological Society with the now more well-known S. Weir Mitchell. Mitchell's notoriety today, if maybe folks may have heard of S. Weir Mitchell in the world, his notoriety today for literary scholars and literary historians is for being the doctor who prescribes the rest cure for Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the author of the story The Yellow Wallpaper. So if you've read The Yellow Wallpaper, Mitchell is the doctor. In his own time, Hammond was probably more famous than Weir was up until the 1890s. Hammond was among the two most famous American neurologists, partly due to a public feud with the other neurologist George Beard, the author of Neurasthenia and American Nervousness. Finally, for all of Hammond's importance within the Civil War, within the history of medicine, within the field of neurology in particular, he's also crucial within the development of sexual science and the history of sexuality. His most influential work on the topic is the 1883 volume Sexual Impotence in the Male. Hammond's practice and case studies first ruled out the anatomical or physiological causes that were inhibiting a man's procreative function. Then he also tried to treat the mental causes. You can see in the first chapter, he tackled the absence of sexual desire, which really meant the absence of the desire, absence of the ability to procreate, procreate. We'll see more examples soon enough, which could be in his finding either congenital or acquired through excessive masturbation, he says, as well as the perversion of the sexual appetite, which could be directed wrongly to non-human objects, primarily in his book, that's shoes that he's discussing as those non-human objects, and individuals of the same sex. He really is a taxonomical thinker who goes through each possible outcome here, each possible inhibition. Hammond is among the very first American writers to use terms derived from the German sexual science, including perversion of the sexual appetite, sexual inversion, and the ancient term pederasty, by which Hammond means anal intercourse without any reference to the age of participants. Usually that term would refer to the age today. He means it without respect to age. Nearly every work within the emergent field of sexual science cites Hammond's case studies. James G. Kiernan, in first utilizing the terms homosexual and heterosexual, G. Frank Lidston, William Lee Howard, Havelock Ellis, even his neurological rival, George Beard. And Hammond is a foundational figure in all of our recent histories of the development of homosexuality, all of which cite sexual impotence in the male. Given that Hammond both builds upon and sets for the United States some of the taxonomies and paradigms for what becomes sexual science and sexology, I'll briefly describe his approach and treatments. In general, when discussing what he calls pederasty, Hammond divided between active and passive participants. Passive participants he treats as much more pathological. The active participants he tends to treat as following presumptively normal behavior, suggesting that this version of same-sex sex is not inconsistent with cross-gender marital outcomes. Often, Hammond points to school-age same-sex sexual activity as fairly routine in boarding schools, though he does not mention other homosocial spaces such as an army camp. These present a problem only if such youthful behavior creates lasting adult habits. Many of Hammond's patients are in their 20s, and their case histories usually feature an earlier initiation of same-sex behavior. While Hammond uses the term sexual inversion, he routinely casts it in developmental terms rather than a fixed from-birth orientation. Sexual inversion is not merely the product of an initiation, but it's also the product of excessive sexual stimulation. Those, as he says here, addicted to pederasty, Hammond writes, usually have exhausted all other sexual stimuli. It is the product of both excessive masturbation and excessive sexual exposure in the world of vice and prostitution. Hammond's descriptions of same-sex acts are, as you might expect, extremely moralized, with phrases like disgusting details. At one point, Hammond suggests that he has many more case studies, but he writes the pen wearies of writing such moral, physical, and hygienic iniquities. Despite that moralizing, Hammond sets out in this exploration with a suggestion of the historical permanence of same-sex sexual desire. As he says here, so long as human nature exists, such instances will occur, and physicians must be prepared to treat them. Crucially, what distinguishes Hammond from later American sexologists such as Kiernan and Lidston is the aim of Hammond's treatment is not framed at rooting out a social disorder, but instead operating at an individual level to help the young men who seek out his care become successful marital and reproduction-oriented men. Now, in suggesting that Hammond had an authentic curative motive with his patients, I don't want to suggest that this necessarily made his treatment any less injurious. Hammond's treatment was in accord with contemporaneous treatments of mental anxieties, recommending physical stimuli, open spaces, outdoor air. Like S. Weir Mitchell and George Beard, Hammond appeared to subscribe to the notion that urban life might be the cause of these modern disorders, advocating something like a West cure through the salubrious effects of the American West. In line with the recommendations of the antebellum anti-masturbation activist Sylvester Graham, whose graham cracker was supposed to lessen urges to masturbation, Hammond suggested cold baths and dietary restrictions. But Hammond also had more immediate remedies for the physical body. Frequently, for his same-sex desiring patients, Hammond applied an electrical stimulus or cauterizing iron to the nape of a patient's neck in an effort to jolt their mental states out of debilitating habits. In doing so, Hammond was following some of the practices of the French neurologist Charcot, and his use of these stimuli indicate that Hammond had begun locating sexual desire in the brain. But there's much evidence in sexual impotence in the male that Hammond had begun locating sexual desire not only in the brain, but also in the human mind, doing so several decades before Freud definitively locates it there. Hammond's prescriptions for same-sex desiring patients contains advice on what patients should do with their minds, with a central theory that mental preoccupation can inhibit sexual desire. In cases where men lack sexual desire, Hammond discovers that such men are often, in his account, preoccupied with complex problems, often the complex problems of mathematics. So confronted with patients exhibiting excessive sexual desire or same-sex desire, Hammond prescribes mental preoccupation, recommending complex math problems as a remedy for same-sex desire. Now, this may seem like a silly remedy today, or maybe not if people are enthusiasts for the de-eroticizing effects of mathematics here. But it does represent a different way of seeing the problem of homosexuality than we might expect from one who had been tasked with the health of the Union Army. So keeping all of this in mind, Hammond's later exploration of the problem of same-sex sex and desire, keeping that in mind, we may return now to whether such concerns appear during his Civil War service. During that period, Hammond published two works that might seem ripe for this exploration. An 1861 lecture on venereal diseases, republished once he became the Army Surgeon General, and an 1863 treatise on hygiene with specific reference to the military service. Neither of these wartime works mention same-sex desire or sex. The former focuses almost entirely on the treatment of sexually transmitted diseases rather than their prevention, though what discussion he gives to their transmission documents soldier sexual intercourse with women nearby an army camp, or in one case, the transmission of syphilis by a shared tattoo needle. The latter work, in a chapter on morbid habits, discusses the problem of masturbation. And you may be wondering at this point why masturbation keeps getting included in this discussion of same-sex sexuality. Throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, there's a looseness in what masturbation describes. Frequently, it's not necessarily a solitary act, as we might think today, but sexual acts involving people of the same sex. Beginning in the 1840s, the problem of masturbation is a preoccupation of the administrators of boarding schools, by which they meant as much the problem of same-sex contact among pupils as they did individual pupils' solitary habits. Hammond, in the treatise on hygiene, makes no such direct conflation. He does treat masturbation as an important problem for the military because, quote, the life of a soldier is often such that he seeks diversion of any kind that offers itself. And it too frequently happens that in masturbation, he finds for a time a relief from the ennui of the camp. Hammond advocates that commanding officers take a strong hand, so to speak, in preventing masturbation by eliminating idleness and providing employment and recreation for their soldiers. So what is the problem of masturbation for the soldier in Hammond's mind? Despite Hammond mentioning that can spread as a learned practice, it's not a social problem for interactions among soldiers. And while its effects are ultimately physical, enervation, weakness, feebleness, it's primarily a problem of the mind. Hammond writes that it is a greater problem than other forms of implicitly heterosexual sexual contact because, quote, in addition to the phenomena which accompany the sexual act, the imagination is more or less brought into the action to produce the necessary mental impression. In this manner, the stimulus to the emission of semen or to the corresponding actions in the female, instead of being derived from the natural source, has its origin in the mind. To Hammond, these problems of sex within the mind are of paramount importance, with an otherwise total absence of the problems of same-sex sexual activity that will constitute a major aspect of his practice in the 1870s and 1880s. This is perhaps unsurprising, given that the problems of the mind are a crucial aspect of the learning that Hammond develops during the Civil War. Another of Hammond's achievements while Surgeon General was the establishment of the Turner's Lane Hospital in Philadelphia. Under the leadership of Hammond's friend, S. Ware Mitchell, Turner's Lane became the first neurological research center in the United States. Many of the soldiers treated there suffered from physical injuries and battle wounds, but a significant number also suffered from ailments for which there appeared to be no corresponding physical cause. As the scholar Randall Noper has written, the Civil War, with its mysteries of nerve injuries and battle fatigue, all beyond the grasp of anatomical explanation, gave impetus to the emergence of neurology. As other historians of medicine have noted, the emergence of neurology and psychology in the United States, and with it, Hammond's postbellum practice in New York City, were an outgrowth of the Turner's Lane research and the war experience of doctors like Mitchell and Hammond. It's only in light of the emergence of this field of medicine that a problem like male sexual impotence appears as something for a neurologist to solve. And it's only within the psychological framework of that field that a problem like same-sex desire gets grouped within the larger issue of male impotence. To take this transformation from the perspective of Dr. Hammond, once the problem of male sexual impotence can be reconceived as a mental as well as physical ailment, then can the seemingly quite different problem of male-male sexual activity become treatable along the same terms as a problem of the mind. But I also want to look at this transformation from the perspective of Hammond's patients. Many of these men were Union veterans, quite possibly drawn to Hammond's care because of his military experience. So I should make plain something that's been implicit so far, that his patients were men. Hammond had some female patients, it seemed, or at least he had access to female case studies. After Sexual Impotence of the Male, Hammond republished that volume along with the second half, Sexual Impotence of the Female. Unlike for his male patients, Hammond never considers contrary sexual desire or sexual inversion within women. He never discusses what we'd call lesbian desire or sex acts. In 1892, he did serve as a witness in the sensational trial of Alice Mitchell for the murder of her lover, Frida Ward, but same-sex female desire never presented the medical problem for him that male same-sex desire did. That may have something to do with how that problem appeared within the lives of his male patients. In most cases, Hammond's male patients are seeking for solutions to sexual problems in order to meet class expectations for marriage and children. In one case, not a same-sex desire case, but in one case of the absence of sexual desire, this condition has little effect on the patient's well-being. He's come to Hammond because if he does not have children, then some family property will, upon his death, go to strangers who are distant relatives. That's the problem that he wants to solve. Those experiencing same-sex desire are very typically, in Hammond's words, a graduate of a college, of an aesthetic turn of mind, well-educated, had traveled extensively, and had ample means at his command. The primary concern, in one case, is that the patient's family was of the highest respectability, a respectability risked by his non-normative sexual behavior. We know that same-sex sexuality is not confined to the middle classes or upper middle classes. It appears so, however, in these case studies, the case studies of this postbellum moment, because it presents a special problem to the normative class expectations of men of this period. Thus, the problem that confronts Hammond's medical practice in the 1870s and 1880s is not one of widespread social vice, not one of an underclass, not one of the supposedly immoral practices of the poor, though Hammond's case studies will subsequently inspire the sexual science that is deployed in exactly those directions. But it's middle and upper middle class men who are otherwise prepared for marriage, but sexually inhibited from achieving those normative expectations. This is a phenomenon that we might equally situate within the post-Civil War moment, especially but not only in the case of veterans. While we rightly think about this period that Charles and Mary Beard call, following Mark Twain, the Gilded Age of extreme inequality between the rich and working class Americans, it was also the period of a rapidly expanding class of managerial men whose unstable status depended on adherence to normative class expectations. It was a moment when industrialization produced a much stronger sense of standardization, which could be applied to one's own life with the apprehension of how much one deviated from the norm, to use language that was being invented at that moment. Indeed, we might imagine Hammond's average patient as a Union Army veteran in his mid-20s who has returned from the war to civilian life in middle-class employment with accumulating property and wealth, and with great expectations for the future in his assumption of a normative middle-class life, were it not for this one problem of sexual desire. I'll just say the phenomena of the veteran in business is very much something that gets treated in literary works of the period, such as Henry James is the American with Christopher Newman and The Rise of Silas Lapham by William Dean Howells. And Henry James, even the Confederate veteran, Basil Ransom, is a lawyer, but very much a lawyer in business. It's also a phenomenon of the Civil War as well. These are much more elite men, but it gives you a sense of the phenomenon. All the Union generals who become railroad executives, all the Confederate generals who become insurance salesmen, really. That idea of moving from being a veteran to being a businessman is part of the post-Civil War moment. So returning to the central question about the role of the Civil War within the development of modern sexuality, there remains very little I can say about the camp life experience of soldiers. But we might say that the Civil War had three distinct effects. First, the production of medical knowledge at a large scale, almost population level, rooted in the dissemination of experimental case studies, a transformation at which Hammond stands at the very center. Second, the emergence and development of the fields of neurology and psychology with newly developed approaches to the problems of non-physiological ailments, that is, to the problems of the mind. Again, Hammond is at the very center. Third, a class of men, many of them veterans, in an expanding middle class, seeking solutions to the sexual problems preventing their full assumption of normative middle class life. These men seek out doctors like Hammond for this particular issue, by which these three war-wrought phenomena come together in Hammond's sexual impotence in the male, which in turn becomes a springboard for the emergence of sexual science, which establishes homosexuality and heterosexuality as permanent orientations and distinct sexual identities. Thank you.